Hello and welcome back to JLXP, a special edition JLXP chrono break of the 2017 spring finals between C9 and TSM. We're going to be doing a retrospective on that series, but also a little bit of a revisiting of C9's trajectory through the LCS, how they got into the moment of 2017 spring, what happened at the Jensen Zhonya's inflection point, and how that also kind of started the path towards how we got here, where C9 is again on the precipice of really becoming the best team in the LCS. But before we get into all that, Keen, how are you feeling about the current spring finals we're about to be seeing, or even just your general thoughts on this 2017 spring finals game 5?
I'm excited in general for spring finals. I think it's been a really weird split, so I'm glad to be able to hit the final stretch here and see what happens. We saw Cloud9 lose a game last week. Maybe they can lose another one this week. It's funny to me that we're doing this, because it's like, oh man, like we don't even remember what it's like to see Cloud9 lose. So we're gonna go back to their most devastating loss in recent memory, just so we can this is just to remind ourselves of what it's like to watch Cloud9 lose, right? I think this is game film for EG and FlyQuest this weekend. It's like, oh yeah, let's watch this, and this is how we're gonna mentally prepare ourselves to take on this behemoth that is Cloud9 2020.
Yeah. Oh man. I mean, so we were kind of going through a list of games of what we could play on the tailgate stream, because obviously there's this big moment and this is kind of the game. But then it's also like, what are some of the other big memorable LCS games of C9 history? And the ones I wrote down were 2014 Spring Finals Game 3, which was the last time C9 really looked unbeatable. You wrote about this in your 10 Thoughts this week as well, where C9 in 2013 summer had a cumulative 30-3 record. But then I think a lot of people forget that in the spring of 2014, they were only one game worse. They were 29-4, and they also swept the playoffs in like devastating fashion. High had a 34.5 KDA in the 2014 spring playoffs, and that was in a Bjergsen LCS. Like that was after Bjergsen. That was the first split Bjergsen had on TSM. So the High's lung collapse is another like huge moment that I feel like we'll talk about at some other point in the future, because that was at this point 6 full years ago, which is pretty crazy to think about. Mm-hmm. But like that was actually the last split C9 won. So all of the highlight games that I've picked out is like, oh yeah, the 2014 summer when like TSM beat them down. Well, not beat them down, like Turtle got a bunch of crits and they upset them in the final, basically, in game 5. And then 2019 summer finals game 5 against TL, again, a C9 loss. And obviously the highlight game we have here, 2017. So, I mean, yeah, it's like C9's legacy, at least within the LCS, is, aside from the 2014-2013 run of dominance, it's been so close, but yet so far away,
Yeah, this series in a lot of ways, and even a little bit the 2016 final before that was like, they had gone a while without making it to the finals. There's the couple TSM CLG ones in a row. Before that, it was always just Cloud9 TSM, and then so it was nice to get it back. And so this roster in a lot of ways was like, hey, this is us finally moving on from the original C9 roster. That I think a lot of like I was an OG C9 fan. I think many people who were introduced to the LCS became an OG C9 fan. And so this roster making it this far was kind of like a, hey, times have changed. This isn't the C9 you're used to anymore. And I think that's kind of happening again. And I think that's kind of the neat inflection. It's like it was 3 years from the OG C9 to this one, and then it's been 3 years since this 2017 one to this one, and of course everything has changed again. We're kind of in a new era of C9, and there's always one holdover from like the previous era, where it was like beforehand Sneaky was the one carrying the torch from the OG C9 squad to this roster, and then from this 2017 roster it was well, nobody, but then Licorice I think right now is kind of the one that's tying the bridge, if you will. So it's interesting to see all these different eras of C9, and it's always like, have you been a C9 fan the whole time?
I would say that it's been Reaper holding the torch from this, because Reaper, I think, was in his second split as a coach in 2017 spring, and now he's going in. This is his 8th split as a coach on C9, at least within all the era, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, I mean, it's crazy when you look at like that, and I talked about this a little too. Is like we had a time coach of the split, and I think I know a lot of people are a little I don't know if hesitant's right, but maybe hesitant to vote on coach of the split because we don't see very much of it. We don't see much of the coaching happening behind the scenes, all of that, like all the whiteboard stuff, all of the draft prep, all of the VOD review. None of us really get to see that. So, but to see that, like, he's done this with so many different rosters and gotten people to buy into what he does, I think has been, they've also, like, I think Cloud9's done a great job of like marketing or branding and showing these little clips that's like, oh, here's Reaper doing something funny. And I think that's been really good to see. And, you know, really good testament to both building your image and also just, I mean, winning solves everything. It's like, hey, this guy must be a good coach. His team's winning.
Yeah. I also think I'll just do a little bit more history building into this game, and then we'll dive a little bit into the series. And after I do this history run, feel free to add in any little color along the way. So we're going through the C9 history. We know they were the dominant team in 2013 summer, 2014 spring, with the 30-3 and the 29-4 records, 59-7 over that 2-split stretch. But then after the Hai Lung collapse, coming into the summer of 2014, they were only 18-10 in the regular season, which, while it was still, I believe, top seed or tied for top seed in the LCS, like, just a huge downgrade compared to what they'd been the past 2 splits. And famously, they lose that final 2-3 to TSM before going on to Worlds, where they're eventually eliminated by Samsung Blue. 2015 spring rolls around, and this is where it becomes evident that they can't hang with TSM Bjergsen, in a sense. This is where Hai gets killed a bunch by Bjergsen in that spring final, and I feel like that sent like ripple effects through a lot of TSM. So 2015 summer is when Incarnation joins, who was Jensen. Hai retires. This is when, like, truly the old C9 kind of dies that you were talking about, and Sneaky eventually becomes the holdover. It's kind of the start of that process, because halfway through the split, after 10 games, Hai comes back in the jungle, but they finish tied for 7th and 8th and eventually make it 2 Worlds from the gauntlet. 2016 spring is when you're really starting to see the turnover in C9. Lemon Nation brings his notebook as a coach. They actually have Rush as the jungler, if you remember. Hai goes to support. Their regular split actually works pretty well. They finished 12-6, which is 3rd, but they lose in the quarterfinals to a 9-9 TSM. And then is when the Reapered era begins. They get Impact. Meteos actually comes back. Hai doesn't really play in 2016 summer split. They're doing the bunny smoothie thing. They actually make it all the way into finals after upsetting Immortals, but then they lose to TSM, because TSM was like the behemoth back in 2016, which brings us to this 2017 moment where they've refreshed their roster a fair bit. They have the beginnings of the kind of 6-man roster with the Impact Ray swaps. They have a rookie jungler in 2017. So even Meteos is gone. It is really just Sneaky left from the old team. And they have that 14-4 regular season split in the spring of 2017. They sweep Phoenix One in the semifinals, and they move on to this finals here. What are your reactions after I kind of just ran through what was essentially 4 years of C9 LCS history?
Yeah, I mean, it's just a lot. Like, it's really crazy when you think about, because I think one of the big things hanging on Jensen's shoulder when he came in was like, oh, he replaced Hai. He's going to be this huge talent, come in to win championships. And of course, he never won a title on Cloud9. And that was kind of one of his, I don't know if regret's the right word, but he did talk a lot about how winning a final meant a lot to him. And that didn't happen until he joined Team Liquid. And so for Cloud9 fans, there's like the promise of like, hey, here's this. And if you don't remember when Incarnation, so there's a lot of drama in Jensen's history. He was known as Incarnation. A lot of drama leading up to his pro play. A lot of toxicity, a lot of that stuff. But people were really excited to watch him play. He was like the solo queue superstar. It's like I can't remember the last like Western player to come into the league that was like, hey, this guy is just gonna be like insane. And So it was really cool back then for us to see him come in and come, and we all expect him to do this insane mechanical. God, that's one of the things I noticed, like even rewatching this series, is like, hey, these guys used to be like when we watched the game, just seeing their mechanics, like I think we've kind of taken it for granted now, but it was cool just to watch and see some of these plays and see how good they've been for so long. But it was just interesting to go back and look at this, and be like, wow, Cloud9 just hasn't won since High left. And even when, after the lung collapse, like their fall was getting back-to-back second place finishes. That's like insanely good for almost every other organization in the league, right?
Yeah.
And so it was just cool to see the history, you know?
Yeah, I completely agree. And I watched the preamble to this series of like the analyst desk before the series even started, and even that is like, it was so long ago, even this 2017 thing, but yet still recent. So like, it was in Vancouver. We had Doublelift on the desk for predictions, actually. And
yeah,
he predicted a 3-2 TSM win, which actually ended up being the correct thing. The analyst desk at the time didn't actually do like numbered predictions. They just said who won. So Zyrene predicted C9 because he thought that the bottom lane of Biofrost Wild Turtle was going to be inconsistent. And Kobe said he didn't want to vote for a rookie in the final because Contracts was a rookie at the time. I just random aside, the rookie of the split vote was actually pretty competitive in 2017 spring. Contracts narrowly beat Acadian, and third place was Cody Sun. So like, we actually had a pretty sweet crop of rookies back then. But yeah, to your point, 6 of the 9 NA finals at this point in time had been C9 versus TSM. So as you mentioned, even when C9 was doing poorly, they were still showing up in finals. And even when TSM wasn't winning, they were still showing up, and at the time had been in every single final. So the build into this was super, super real.
Yeah, I mean, TSM back then, I think people, I don't know, it's almost weird to be like, oh, any new fans here who don't remember, because you and I have been around for so long. When we think TSM, I think we still think like, oh yeah, of course TSM, they're gonna win, they're gonna make it to the finals. Of course, that hasn't been true in 2.5 years now. Like TSM is just like watching all this stuff this week is like, oh, it was really like, and you see TSM fans and like people, and I think analysts and whatnot, you talked about it a little as well. It's like, oh, it's really disappointing for TSM to like what's wrong, quote unquote, with TSM. And for me, it's like, isn't this just expected? Like, is it like, it's been 2.5 years of this. This is just like, I'm sorry, TSM, this is just your par for the course now. You're not a championship contender. Like, I think the idea is like, oh, you want to be, and I think that's fair. I think every team wants to be, though. But like, you don't look at, say, Golden Guardians and be like, oh, what went wrong? Like, they clearly wanted to win the championship too. It's just like, it's par for the course for TSM, unfortunately, the last few years. And so it was nice to kind of go back and look at this roster and be like, oh yeah, this is Baylife. This is the TSM team that just slammed everybody. They made dozens of finals in a row. And now, you know, it's like, it's kind of sad to look back on the last podcast you had, and it was like, oh, look, TSM has really like, they've really fallen off.
And agreed. Getting back to this series, it was rewatching it. It was almost a sweep. Game 1 was just total destruction by TSM. It's 16 kills to 1. Hauntzer's 9-0 on Camille. There was all this drama because Arrow won the MVP this year, and all the TSM fans thought Hauntzer should have won, who ended up finishing second, and Bjergsen was third in the votes. So what happened is Bjergsen and Hauntzer split so many votes that Arrow ended up winning it out. And Hauntzer was going up against the, quote, sword and shield C9, where Ray would play carries and Impact would play tanks. And what happened this series is Hauntzer, he matched tank for tank and carry for carry in almost every game, which was like really cool to see. Anyway, game 1, TSM totally stomps. Game 2, TSM actually stomps harder because they win in 22 minutes and 38 seconds, even if it's 23 kills to 6. At this point, Hauntzer's 14-0-6 in the series, and Bjergsen was 9-1-4 in that game too. But then it's like, the C9 reverse sweep potential thinking starts coming in, because game 3 is this wicked back and forth, highly, as you mentioned, like the mechanics in this series was super high in terms of how teams were really just willing to go for it. That's a 48-minute game where C9 eventually wins it, and TSM looked kind of pissed coming off the stage when I was watching it. Game 4, C9 smashes TSM 13-1, 31 minutes. Momentum's in C9's favor. Contracts, he was shit in the first 2 games, looks really good in game 3 and 4, and it sets up this game 5, which is, you know, the purpose of this podcast, where the fan vote at the start is actually 50-50. That's when we were doing those like live updating Twitter vote graphs, actually 50-50 in this moment. And it's also the closest game by far in the series in terms of how back and forth it goes. Anything that you want to add to the rundown of the series I just gave?
I think the rundown's great. It was just interesting Impact and Ray go back and forth. It was one of those weird things too. It would be like, so I think Ray came in game 3, won it, and then C9 sat him and put Impact back in, who had just lost game 2, and then Impact won game 4, and then they're like, oh, we're gonna sit Impact again. And it's one of these things. It's not like when you say the carry and the tank thing, it's not like you do the draft and then you decide who plays. It's like, as soon as you put Impact out or you put Ray out, it communicates, oh, this is exactly what they're going to do, because you know that type of player. And so Ray played the 2 games at the end. It was Fizz in the middle of the 3rd game, which was awesome to watch. And that was the other thing. It was like, looking back at the series, there's a lot of cool champions that, looking back, it's like, oh, yeah, that champion used to be a pick in pro play. And then in game 5, we had the Kled come in from the top side. And it was just interesting to see, like why I would love to go back, honestly, and be like, what was the actual thought process? Like, did they know they were just going to go back and forth with the top laners there? Was it just something to kind of keep Hauntzer on his toes? It was just interesting to see them rotate in and out there. But you know, the Fizz was awesome though. Like, if you have time, I would also go watch game 3. That was really fun just to watch. Fizz is one of those champs that looks like super mechanically awesome to, like, I think it looks as cool when he uses his E to like jump on the trident, but it's like, if you play Fizz, it's actually super easy to do, but it looks, I think, a lot cooler than it is actually difficult to execute. So you know, a really fun game to go back and look at. Yeah,
and I liked your point in terms of bouncing the top laners back and forth, and that is kind of what it felt more to me like C9 was doing, of, you know, let's just almost give each of them a breather, and they're going to play a little bit differently, because Ray was nuts when he played. Like, he would just go, he would feed or get fed, or sometimes both in the same game. And the other thing that stood out to me was the support meta, weirdly enough, and kind of what that did to the game at the time. So almost every support pick was an enchanter in the series. Like game 1, it was Lulu on one side, Zyra on the other, but then it was Lulu versus Karma. There was a support Gragas pocket pick that came out in game 4 by Smoothie that we kind of shocked TSM. But then game 5 was Lulu versus Nami. And this is a callback to when junglers had Tracker's Knife. So I think one of the big things that's happened since the removal of Tracker's Knife, while the overall game has benefited from the more educated guessing teams have had to do, the way team comps look has changed, because I think in a lot of cases, people feel like Enchantress supports are unplayable because they're too squishy to ward on their own. And what used to happen is the mobile junglers would get the advanced vision, like the Kha'Zix or the Lee, and if someone was there, they could back away. And then the enchanters would give the supplemental vision, whereas when you only have the support as your primary vision guy, no one's giving you advanced vision, so they have to be tanky. Anyway, watching the Lulu and the Nami kind of interact with this series was really interesting to me, because you'd have these moments where I kind of feel like it just allowed the carries to be more, because the Lulu ults would come in and save Syndra, right? You just don't see that anymore. If Syndra gets jumped on, Syndra dies. Whereas here, it's like Syndra gets jumped on, you take her to 10% health, the Lulu ult comes in, and then Syndra wipes your team, right? I don't know. I really loved how explosive this was, and I think part of it was from the champion picks, but obviously part of it was just from the hype of the fans who were like popping off, hype of the rivalry of, you know, Bjergsen versus Jensen, but just a little bit of a kind of a game point that stood out to me. Were there any other kind of game points that stood out to you looking back 3 years into the time capsule?
I think that point is really good. It was just funny to see when you talk about when you see Enchantress, you think, oh, if there's Enchantress, then we're not really going to see them play anything that like dives too hard. But then we had stuff like Kha'Zix, you had stuff like Echo, like previously in the series, you saw the Kled pick come through. Camille was in, so it was like they were like, oh yeah, you got an Enchanter, we're still going to just jump on you though. So it's always a fun interaction to see, unless you are like Lulu's one of my least favorite champions in the game to play against. Like Lulu is, I don't think that's anybody who plays, I think like a mid lane primary role or like any sort of, if you are a type player who plays something that goes in, you hate Lulu's guts. You hate Lulu. Lulu's one of those champs that comes in and just blocks everything you do. And so, I personally am happy that we are in a bit of a tank support meta. It makes it a lot easier to jump on the carries. So, that's my little anti-Lulu spiel there.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, it's exactly right. It has the pros and the cons of being able to jump on carries or not jump on carries. Even like the Kha'Zix jungle as well. You just don't see that anymore.
Yeah, you know.
So game 5, really back and forth. First blood happens top lane. Contracts is popping off. Jensen dies by being over aggressive. He's been like a little hit or miss all series, honestly. Jensen was coming off of 2 good Syndra games in games 3 and 4, but in game 5, C9 first picks the Lulu blue side, and immediately Bjergsen hops on the Syndra again. So for the second time, Jensen tries to counter it with Echo because he tried the same thing in game 2 and it didn't work then either. And early on, it doesn't work. But as the game starts getting hype, Ray comes mid, kills Bjergsen, burns his summoner spells after Jensen gets him low on the Echo. The game, like this was a skirmish heavy game that we saw. By 18:30, it's 9 kills to 9. Jensen's 3-1, Bjergsen's 4-2. So during all this skirmishing, like it's not Bjergsen and Jensen trading kills with each other. It's like Jensen and Bjergsen killing everyone else and like starting to get fed. It just like the game just kind of felt like it kept accelerating, by 33 and a half minutes, like C9 is just diving over and over again. The weird thing to me, and I don't know what you thought about this as I was rewatching it, is like, I think today during the cast, Azael and I were so like hyped up in the game and what C9 was doing was working. But like the Kled Echo, they were just playing front to back. Like they were just going in with the Kled ult rather than these flanks, because it felt like TSM was actually weirdly in this series, because comparing it to the current day TSM, like TSM was so disciplined and so together. Like their front to back team fighting discipline and patience was just so good to stay in this game as C9 onslaught of them, because it's like C9 wasn't flanking. They weren't really 1-3-1ing. What did you think about kind of this stage in the game before we get to the big Zonies moment?
No, I think I agree. I think I saw that Ray seemed to press R on Bjergsen every time it was up. It was like, there's every time, like there was a mid lane dive early. It was just, Ray had a like insane game. Like I feel like if they had gone on to win, Ray would have been extremely decorated in this history. And of course, because they lost, you just kind of don't get to see that. Like even in the final fight, Ray had, I think, great engage. And and we're going to get there. They should have won that fight based on what Ray did, I think. And I feel like this game that Ray had was so awesome to watch. Just all the Kled. I don't know if that was right necessarily to always just go front to back, but it was working. Like they were winning fights off of it, and they were skirmishing well. And I think going front to back also helped, because I think Svenskeren was playing a really insane game on Lee Sin actually. And I think going front to back, it prevented Lee Sin from getting a lot of these like kick engages. I think he was getting a lot of good kicks and like a lot of like super like Svenskeren's Lee Sin this series, which is, I was sitting there, it reminded me a lot of Blabber actually. I was sitting here, I was like,
was so
wow,
good.
This is like just, it was just like a super high mechanical Lee Sin player. And of course, Svenskeren, for whatever reason, has become kind of a meme at this point. Even after winning the MVP last split, he was still kind of getting memed. But here's like he's a super mechanically good when he's on point. Like, and I think maybe that's the thing people never really question is like when Svenskeren isn't just running it down, he's one of the best junglers in the league. So it was good to see, and Svenskeren being one of the holdovers coming into this weekend, weirdly enough, is, hey, this guy was insane. So it was cool to see this, like, I don't know if I'd call it a fiesta. I think people always call stuff like this fiesta, but it felt like watching an LPL game, and if you're
Yeah.
going to call an LPL game a fiesta, then it's like, well, that region's also producing winners. So I don't know. Maybe these teams, maybe the series was ahead of its time and just in the wrong meta of like too many wards, you know?
Maybe. I mean, geez, you brought up so many good points there. Like Svenskeren and Turtle were in this game on TSM and are still relevant today. They're in championship weekend. They're in the championship qualifier. The winner, they're on different teams. The winner will eventually go face the C9 team. The Svenskeren Lee Sin was just wicked good. He would every time he was on it in this series, because I remembered this is only half a year removed from 2016 Summer TSM, where I remember a moment on stage after TSM had beaten Samsung in the first group stage game. So this is before the Lucian Victor moment. It was either Bjergsen or Doublelift who called Svenskeren the best Lee Sin in the world. And obviously it's your own teammate saying it, and it's NA hype, and it's a Worlds in NA, but I think that was legitimately a conversation, and he's right in there, and he still had that in this series. Like, he was still so incredible on this pick, and this is also kind of peak TSM Bjergsen Syndra, where whenever he had this pick, it felt like he just controlled everything, right? Because they had enough vision, he'd put himself in positions where he wouldn't get people behind him, and you just couldn't walk towards him. So watching this series, and especially this game where you have that history of the Svenskeren Lee and the Bjergsen Syndra, and C9 is like breaking it because they're getting through to him. They're killing him enough. They're getting a gold lead. They're getting Baron, and that brings us to this moment. We'll touch on it, and then we'll talk about the ripple effects of everything that happened. So here's what happened. For those of you who just watched it, it's fine. For those of you who didn't, you can go check the VOD. Or I realized I did a team fight breakdown of this fight after I watched it. It was in it was in my recommended videos on YouTube. It would be like team fight breakdown with Jad. And I was happy with myself. The things that I saw watching it in 2020 were like, oh yeah, I pointed that out in the team fight breakdown. It was great. So what happened before the fight was actually super important. This game was basically like a long team fight. It was 4 minutes of team fighting basically until the Nexus fell. So C9 wins the fight at Baron, and then they go to get mid priority, which is something we've talked about a lot more, but didn't necessarily talk a lot about in 2017. And as they are trying to escort that Baron minion wave towards an inhibitor, Bjergsen catches Sneaky in mid. He lands a stun on him rather than just going to kind of go down and control the Elder Drake. And that burns the Lulu ult. So there is now a half health Lucian and an altless Lulu when TSM start Elder, and they actually kill the wave. So C9 was unable to defend their wave, which is like huge. The fight actually never needed to happen if C9 has Ray stepping in front instead of Sneaky trying to contest Bjergsen off, because then he never gets caught, and none of this happens. But anyway, it happens. They dive in. The redemptions are put in the wrong places. Jensen goes from 2,200 health with his parallel convergent shield to 0 in under a second, because Bjergsen WQs him and Camille ult with the true like the super empowered Camille Q on him, and that's it. That's the end of Jensen, and they lose the fight and they lose the game. And zeroing in exactly on that moment, I feel like at least now I have maybe even a larger sense of clarity, because I'd rewatched the whole game in its entirety, and it was something that Jensen was fully capable of pressing Arizonias on, because the tell to me was the Camille ult windup more than anything else. Jensen had been able to react to that Camille ult during this game and ult out of it, and it ruins the Camille, because you burn the cast time and you don't get stuck in the Hextech ultimatum. So when he didn't do that, Sure, he could have zone used, but the fight was probably already lost. He just needed to R right away. He didn't. He died. The game is over like 40 seconds later because TSM just pushes bot after winning the fight, and C9 can't push up through mid lane. What did you think reliving this like really emotional moment?
So when Jensen goes in, so I play a decent amount of Echo. So I think what basically happened was, so he uses his E. I don't know how you guys remember, like, I don't know what training you had to go through to remember all these ability names, but like when you see casters on air talk, like to remember all the ability names, that is some sort of mystical. Like I've been playing this game for years. I can tell you what every single ability does, but I could not tell you the names of like even 5% of them. So whatever echoes E, and that's the thing where it just lets them. Like, I don't know, do you know the name of it? Like,
phase dive. I've basically gone towards so because most people don't know all the names, I don't say all the names because I'd rather be clear. Yeah. Everyone knows Echo E. Okay. Not everyone knows phase dive. I'm checking it right now.
I'm going to say you're probably correct. So he E's in, and so the way that works is you roll a little bit, and then if you can find a target, it lets you jump a little bit more and jump on your target. And so it felt like he rolled in, and I think he was desperately looking for somebody to hit that second proc on the E, because at that point you do a ton of damage if you find it, because you have Lich Bane, you have all that stuff. And and I think as he was about to click on Hanser clicks ult, and I think that slight delay probably prevented him from hitting it. It was like, it just causes your brain to stutter, and I feel like just from a mechanical aspect, that's probably what happened. Was he's looking for a target for the E. He gets ulted by because Camille ults and becomes invulnerable, so you can't click on her in that particular moment. And I think his brain just kind of farts in that moment. It's like a little bit of an overload. And I think, of course, it's a high pressure situation already. The Elder has been started. They're coming through this gap. You're also going extra fast because you're coming through this Kled ultimate, and you want to try and get on something. I think the onus is on him to like, I have to carry this fight. And I think that's a good onus to have. You saw this happen with the Shy last year, and in the semifinals at Worlds, it's like he stepped way too far forward on Kayle and ended up getting killed. I love like I unironically love watching players, like superstar players, die when they're too far forward. I think when a superstar player dies because they're too far forward, it's not because they're inting, like, they didn't just like halfway through the game decide like, shoot, I just, I gotta go pee real quick, so I'm just gonna like, let's get this game over with. When they're that far forward, it means that they are trying to make a play to win the game. If you've ever played a game where like you're playing with your friends and you're the Smurf, and I think anybody that's like even gold or higher elo and has played with their friends who are in like bronze or in silver, you've been the guy that you got 20 kills, the rest of your teammates aren't doing anything, and like, hey, I have to, if I die once, we lose this game, but I also have the ability to kill everybody. And I think anybody who's been in that situation, I think that's kind of what Jensen felt in this particular moment was, hey, I need to be the dude who carries. And I think that is a great mentality to have. And I think when it backfires, though, you do start seeing players, hey, maybe they don't make that same play the next time. Like maybe double F dashing into the victor right there. Like maybe he doesn't do it again next time. And I think that's really bad when that happens, right? And I think you see the Shy, that didn't affect him at all. Like you watch him at all this, he still does the same crap, right? And I think that's what you need. Like you need to be able to keep making these plays, like even if it backfires, even if it becomes like this highlight reel, like, and of course this became like, we replayed this clip so much, I think the community ended up memeing us for it going into summer. It was like, this Jensen, like we would start like every highlight reel, like, look at this Jensen's played, like, and I think that's kind of thing that's
the teaser. I think the teaser for 2017 summer was just him like staring at the camera after we like replayed the clip or something. Like it was just.
So I mean, it's just one of those things. It's like I absolutely sympathize with him that moment. But I love watching star players get caught out in like bonobo moments like that. It means they're trying to do something.
It's true. And so what gets lost in the remembrance of this moment is how incredibly well Jensen had played to this moment. He was 615. He was max items. He had done Ludens before Deathcap, and this was a different Ludens than we currently know. This was a high AP move speed item, not necessarily a Lost Chapter type of mana starting item. So it was definitely like, hey, I'm rushing to 6 items, I'm getting more move speed, and I'm going to get like power now. So it's a little bit like Spellbinder, but it had like a Ludens proc on it. Anyway, he was maxed items, 6-1-5, going for this play. And I like your double lift analogy as well, because like even that game from the previous year, like that play moved double lift into temporarily retiring, like in a big picture. And this play with Jensen, I think eventually moved him off of C9. Like if he did so much in this game against Bjergsen Syndra, against Svenskerens Lee Sin, against Verisalts, against Nami Bubbles, against Nami Tidal Waves. And his team wasn't even setting up flanks. Ray was just going. And Jensen's like, all right, I got to find a way of running that Syndra Nami as Echo. And he did it perfectly for 40 minutes. And then his brain overloads after carrying the team, and it's Jensen's fault. You know what I mean? Like, that is just, and you could see it on the broadcast how much he was shaking right after the play, how he was more devastated than anyone else on C9. And it's like he took all of the brunt of that moment when, like, honestly, Sneaky got caught mid, and that moment didn't need to happen. But like that's not going to be the public conversation, because that's not how sports works. That's not how that moment works. But man, what a moment, and the ripple effects it had after this moment were also huge. But what? Yeah, I mean, any final thoughts on this like ridiculous finish?
Like if Jensen and C9 win there, then suddenly I think, like you said, hey, you have this legacy of winning now. It becomes a lot harder to switch. You don't need to go join on Team Liquid now to chase your championship, because you already have it, right? You don't have to chase this dream that like you don't have to redeem yourself in this weird way. There's no like people won't meme you anymore for like we say, oh, players shouldn't have such a thought. They shouldn't read Reddit very much, as we're the players, like as we basically want them to. It's like this weird conundrum for fans. Like, oh, they love it when players interact and respond with communities, but then they're also like, oh, you shouldn't read Reddit too much. It's like there's of course there's a middle ground there, but it's also this weird situation. Like, I'm not going to blame players for, I think, responding too much to the criticism. Like, I wish they wouldn't, but we're all human, right? So it's like it's one of these things you end up doing it, and there's just C9 has a full history of like these. Hey, like if this had just flipped a little differently, what would the roster look like? Like the original C9 squad. Like, what happens if Wild Turtles didn't crit in the bush on Game 5 in 2014 summer? Then Cloud9 wins potentially, and maybe that OG C9 squad sticks together. Hai doesn't retire. Maybe Jensen doesn't even come over to NA. And there's so many different like what if, like hey, if you're a TSM fan looking at it from this side, what if they had just 3-0'd here, right? And if they 3-0'd here and Wild Turtle like had a great Game 3, and they honestly should have 3-0'd looking at how Game 3 went. And hey, what if they had won really hard here? Maybe TSM sits here and says, oh, we don't need Double Lift back. And this is a huge like what if moment for me in history, is the fact that Double Lift ended coming back for one split and then left again. I'm sitting here like, what if you had just kept Wild Turtle? Would that TSM roster have just stayed together and not collapsed? Like, because they rebuilt, of course, in 2018, and then again with Sven Mithy. Like, what happens if you kept Turtle and you just said, fine? Would you have rebuilt the roster? Would Double Lift have gone to Liquid eventually? And would TSM have suffered this insane collapse from 10, 11, 12 straight finals all the way down to not making 1 in 5 straight splits now? It's a lot of different moments, like even just within this series that you can look at. It's like it's that Doctor Strange thing. We went down one path out of 14 million. What happens if any of these other things happen? And that was the thing I started thinking about. Is like it'd be interesting. Like what happens if you kept Turtle? Because I know in hindsight now, they've come out and there was a lot of resentment at Double Lift from the TSM roster at the time for having taken the split off, right? Of course, they welcome him back with open arms because, like, hey, it's Double Lift. Yeah. Even though Turtle's good, Turtle's a great player at the time, especially. And but you still you take back Double Lift, and so he comes back, and they go to Worlds again, and of course they flounder again, and I think that's the end of TSM as we know it.
That's it. Yeah, I love that. I love thinking about all the possibilities and the the question of like even this series getting pushed so close to the limit. And then I think ultimately it was the 2017 MSI misstep that moved them for sure to moving Turtle away. But like if they 3-0 into that MSI, maybe the movement of their team is different. And for C9, like with how dynamic Ray was at the time and how good Jensen actually is if he's able to get that chip off of his shoulder. Because so here's a quote that we had in the teaser. Jensen says, he said this before the 2017 spring finals, people only really remember the winners, so win means everything. Yet, in this moment, somehow it's tragic. People remember Jensen for losing, right? Like, how messed up is that, that ended up happening? But because they lose, right? Let's just we're going to do some theoretical stuff here. Let's run through the timeline of what happens after. So they lose this. They move into 2017 summer where they actually lose in the quarterfinals again. They lose to the Someday Dignitas team, 3-1. It's like the Someday top lane Maokai and the Altec Sivir, who just like went on a bit of a surge towards the end of the split, and C9 actually loses to them in 2017. So 2018 spring is when the losing the offseason meme really starts picking up steam because Impact goes to TL. And Contracts doesn't even come back, even though a lot of people think he's a pretty promising rookie jungler. So they sign Svenskeren, they start Licorice, and their roster is Licorice, Sven, Jensen, Sneaky, and Smoothie. And they actually start really, really well in spring. They were 7-1 before a showdown with Echo Fox, who was another 7-1 team. But the back half of their spring split is bad. They end 11-7. There was a 4-way tie between second and sixth. They end up 5th out of that tiebreaker, which gives them a first-round matchup against Team Liquid, who 3-0s them in quarterfinals. So again, 2 splits in a row with a quarterfinals exit. 2018 summer, that's when all hell breaks loose. Like, this is peak Reaper power. They have 9 different starters. And it's also the moment in time when patch 8.11 hits and mages are a thing in the bottom lane. So Jensen even has a bot lane game during this. But they play 9 different people. Zazel and Smoothie are swapping time. Keith and Sneaky are swapping time. Blabber and Svenskeren are swapping time. Jensen and Golden Glue are swapping. By the end of it, they settle on a 7-man roster where Jensen and Blabber are a mid-jungle duo and Sven and Golden Glue are a mid-jungle duo. I do think Reaper was a bit ahead of his time here in valuing the mid-jungle duo synergy more than he valued the bot support synergy, because he broke Zazel. He broke the Sneaky Smoothie Zazel Keith and just said, all right, Sneaky Zazel, and it's the mid-jungle that we want to swap. Anyway, they make it all the way to the freaking. Actually, I'll let you. I've done a lot. I'll let you chime in here.
Yeah, I mean, that was the fun split. That was the whole all the bench memes came out, and like Cloud9 had at this point become so good at like turning all these roster decisions into these weird memes, and people are like, well, yeah, okay, well, let's just run with this. And this was actually a pretty pivotal moment for Cloud9 in the sense that because Jensen had to split time, I think that was one of the major contributing factors to him deciding like to eventually leave. And I think it left a lot of resentment in a lot of players that split. I think no matter what you say, like it's one of these things, and this, and we talked about this, I think on one of the previous episodes about how Svenskeren being MVP last split was always something that I didn't think I thought he was great when he played, but I think he only played like 15 of the actual games because he was splitting a little bit of time with Blabber. And it was always hard for me to give MVP to somebody who splits time. And I think if you are a player, you are thinking the exact same thing. It's not like sports where like, hey, I'm Michael Jordan, but I can't play 48 minutes in this game. I need at least like a 5-minute breather here. This isn't the same thing. You're not sitting there as a jungler and be like, oh, yeah, why don't we put Svenskeren in? I feel like he could be better than me in this particular situation. Or like, oh, let's put Blabber in. Like, he's better than me at early game. If you are a League of Legends player with any sort of pride as a professional, which you should, you are not going to you just feel like you should always be the better option. It's not, you don't need a breath. You don't need any sort of player to step in for you. There isn't like a situation where you should, and if you ever happen to believe that, I think you really need to reassess your own pride and your own ability to play the game. Because if you're a pro player, I feel like you should have a lot of confidence in yourself to feel like I should always be the best option. And at least you should strive towards that, right? Like, you might understand that, hey, objectively speaking, that's just not how it's been this split. But from a personal perspective, as you finish and you get a step back, I would be like, look, I can do anything that guy can do if you give me a bit of time, especially over the offseason. And if you're not willing to commit to me over long term, then I'm going to find somebody that will commit to me. And if you're a superstar level player like Svenskeren or a superstar level player like Jensen, then you should believe that splitting time is kind of an insult to you as a player. And I don't blame them for leaving after splits like that, especially for Jensen. It's like, hey, I haven't won anything while I'm here, even on this team. Like, I'm not even the face of this franchise. Like, at that point it was Sneaky, and then it started looking like, oh, Licorice was going to be the next guy they're investing in. So if you're Jensen, you've always been this dominant player, but you've always kind of been in the shadow of your own teammates won, and also you've been in the shadow of Bjergsen in terms of looking at mid laners as a whole. And I think the idea of trying to go out and make a name for yourself otherwise made a lot of sense for me. So it's interesting to look back at like Zhonya's game in particular and be like, hey, like the markings of this have always been here. Like, Jensen's always been dominant, but just always in the shadow of something else. And in this case, it was the shadow of his own mistake, right? And his career has kind of unfolded in this weird way. Cause even when he went on and won on Team Liquid, I don't know if that many people gave him too much. Like, I think you give him enough credit, but it's still like Liquid is always Doublelift's team. It's never Jensen's team. Jensen's never been the guy. And this was the moment where he was supposed to be the guy.
Yeah, he's the guy.
He would have been the guy. And then he doesn't hit R, he doesn't hit Zhonya's, and he kind of flounders this one moment to be the guy. And if this had gone differently, and if he had hit those buttons, then maybe Jensen becomes the guy that we expected him to be when he came pro. And maybe his career unfolds a lot differently, because I think a lot of people have kind of bought into this narrative. Jensen's kind of been a mechanical decline. I don't know if I'd be curious actually if you think that's true or not. And maybe that stems from this moment, like before this, leading into this. Is this the moment where Jensen's kind of quote unquote decline begins? Like, does it? Because I know he had that really strong afterwards, but it's just this weird thing to look back and be like, hey, like when does it actually begin?
Yeah, I'm glad we stopped at the 2018 summer, because none of that happens based on what you just said if the 2017 spring Jensen wins the split and gets the recognition. Because, and this is where we get a little bit into the realm of speculation of even what happened, not even what could have happened, because I remember the 2018 summer madness of C9 Academy getting bumped to the starting role. Like, Jack and Reaper kind of said it was a motivation thing. And it did anger the starters. It angered Sneaky and Jensen and Smoothie at the time. They even had those like Instagram pictures of like being benched or something, right? Like there was weird salt coming out from the camp. And then there was that really awkward video that C9 behind the scenes released of the moment that Jensen and Sneaky were actually told they were benched, and that they shipped that. Yeah. So there was just this huge violation of trust within the organization, but it was all, it's weird because you can put on your goggles and say how they were able to improve. Because I think there were definitely issues that were identified within C9. Like, I have no doubt at the moment, from the Zhonya's moment, where Jensen can be the guy, he can stop feeling like he needs to be the guy, and he can just kind of accept it and no longer needs to press so hard. And I know you mentioned you love seeing players step up farther than they need to and stuff, but maybe, and obviously it's speculation, like maybe it changes at its core if C9 wins that 2017 title. And maybe the 9-man roster doesn't even happen. And that's when you start getting into these really weird theoreticals of, like, does Blabber exist, like, as a C9 player? Because maybe...
Does he exist, period? Like, Blabber just
do they even bring in Svenskeren, right? Do they even do that? Like, does Contracts get another year? because he was a rookie on C9 for a year and then he was gone. Then they brought in Svenskeren, right? Is contracts supposed to be this from 2017 that ended up coming to a head in 2018 before C9 really, before, the Jensen relationship was irreparably damaged and he moved to Team Liquid and finally won his title. But man, there are too many possibilities to think about to know what could happen, because from the jungle to the mid to even like Sneaky and Smoothie being on that team, whether or not Zeyzal needs to come in, maybe all that changes with a different result.
Insecurities of like having a burner account, all that stuff. I'm gonna throw it at you and say, like, there's just a lot of interesting parallels. Like, Kevin Durant felt like he couldn't win on the squad that was already like maybe the second best, could have been the best team if they hadn't joked a 3-1. There's some parallel here. So in 2017, they choked the lead against the Warriors, and if that hadn't happened, then maybe was it 16 that they choked the 3-1 lead?
Oh,
I think it was 16 actually.
They played so many times in a row. But yeah, it was 16. They lost the 3-1 lead. But that's also when Durant lost the 3-1 lead to the Warriors. And then he just goes.
Yeah, that's the one I'm talking about. Yeah. So so they kind of choked that lead, similar to how Jensen chokes this moment here. And it was like and I've thought about this before, and people have cracked this joke about Jensen being Kevin Durant when he went and joined Team Liquid chapter. Because yeah. So people have cracked this joke obviously before, but there's this like interesting parallel of superstar players who feel pressured to win championships, and it's like, and that's a huge thing in the NBA. Is like your legacy is completely tarnished if you don't win an NBA title, and I think the LCS. There's a little bit of that even in like I think people were memeing like before the split. I released the survey that asked like, would you rather win the LCS or would you rather make it out of groups? And people were flaming like I think 60% of NA players said they'd rather make it or they'd rather win the LCS. And people were kind of memeing it. It was like, they don't have aspirations. Which one, it was like, hey, they're like those two things are not mutually exclusive. And then two, you literally have to win a title to be able to make it to Worlds to begin with. But the idea to me was like, hey, winning a split actually matters a lot more than I think some fans seem to care for. And for Jensen, who has been in this moment, and I don't know if you realize. Like, if you've never been to a live game, and Spring 2017 in Vancouver was actually my first live event, so it was cool to be able to witness this in person. But if you've never been to a live game and you don't see what happens immediately on stage, or if you're not paying attention, like let's say you're somebody who just watches VODs, what happens after TSM wins this game, there is no delay. They win, they jump up, they celebrate. The other team does not get, like, it's not like we drop a curtain on the other team and they get to just hide, right? Like, they have to sit there for a little bit as like all this confetti rains down on it. Like you've seen the famous photos of like Faker and Bang in their boots, just kind of sobbing, crying as like it's all this confetti and fanfare drops. The crowd is going nuts, but it's not for you. You're in this moment. Like Jensen sitting here, you saw him shaking already, so he's already like. So it's not just that he has to watch that moment. It's like as soon as he dies and he sees his death timer, and then he sees the rest of his teammates fall, and he sees TSM start pushing bottom, he knows. Like that they've lost. Like we are not, like the players are not dumb. They know when they've lost the game. And so Jensen has this moment where he has to sit and stare at his grayed out screen. And then he has to sit there and listen to the confetti and the crowd and everything go off. And he's just sitting there for moments. It's probably like the most quiet, loud moment in his career. And so you have that moment and you never want that to happen again. You want to go win the title to kind of redeem and like capture that moment. And I think that's the thing that you have, like getting knocked out of groups is like whatever, like if you're an NA team, like a lot of times you've been knocked out before you even played. Like you get knocked out by your fourth or fifth game, like the sixth game, your last game on stage doesn't even matter. You've had time to collect yourself. The expectations are a lot different. You still see a lot of different teams. Like you're not the last one knocked out. You're not one step away from winning the whole thing. And like if you talk to players, like they will talk to you about that win moment being like still a really special moment for players. And I think that's the thing that's really undersold here is Jensen having to sit through the gray screen, sit through all this fanfare, and that's the thing that sticks in his head. And I think that's the kind of thing you see from like in NBA players like chasing titles. Like Kevin Durant knows what it's like to be super close. Jensen knew what it was like to be super close. And because you're that close, you'd never want to experience.
And with Jensen, when they did win, it was because someone else did it. Even if like doesn't matter. Like, so Durant, and this is for people that don't want the NBA analogy, kind of let me explain it. Like the Warriors are Steph Curry, Draymond Green, and Klay Thompson. That was the 73 win Warriors. And then Durant joining on that team made them be perceived as unfair. So then 2 years in a row, Durant is actually their best player in the finals. He wins 2 finals MVPs, but like no one cares. In a sense, Durant thinks that doing this is finally going to make people think, hey, Durant is better than LeBron. Durant is greater than LeBron. But it just doesn't happen. And I do wonder, like now, if we were to talk to Jensen, obviously winning NA gives him some satisfaction because he did win 2 titles on Liquid. But for what he's done in his career, like how great this guy has been in so many regular seasons, Jensen has 0 league MVPs and 2 finals wins. And if you're comparing careers, even if he has these titles, it's like he's still so far away from Bjergsen's legacy, even if as a player and as a skill, he's just as good, if not better, in some splits. So, yeah, I love that analogy in terms of what this could have meant for even his legacy if he wins this and was able to turn it into more wins. He's had splits where he's been like a point away from MVP, but just hasn't gotten it. He's honestly a player who's just been so close to being considered, like, and this is a bit of an overstep because we're kind of in the moment, but I feel like a few things break differently, and Jensen's the GOAT and a mid laner. But
yeah,
they just haven't broken. And yeah, it's cool to think about.
I mean, it's like people don't want to see you win as much as they want to see you overcome adversity, right? And I think like if you look at, for example, there's a lot of this talk about like, oh, NA just always brings these import players in. I have a lot of thoughts on that, but I think the crux of it is we don't want to like it doesn't mean anything. Let's, for example, if we bring let's say we import the entire FPX roster to NA and overcoming the thing that was blocking us. And I think what people really want to see is for us to overcome our I don't know if calling it a metaphor is a little over dramatic or too romanticizing it, but I think the idea is you see a little bit of yourself when you watch this. And so your favorite teams that you latch onto, when they're able to overcome barriers that block them, I think it serves as inspiration and motivation for you to kind of overcome like whatever it is that's blocking your own. Like, I think it really does motivate you and make you feel like, hey, I just watched this team overcome this thing that was really blocking them. I think that really motivates you to kind of tackle things in your own life. And I think what happens when you see like, oh, Jensen went and joined Team Liquid, it's almost taking like this shortcut or cheating your way to the top. And like, of course, they were like a great team, but when you see that happen, it's like, oh, that type of option isn't available, I think, for everybody when you break it down to like real life situations. Like, you were to use it like as a metaphor for like, oh, how do you overcome adversity in your own life? We don't all have access to that cheat path that we can just suddenly be like, oh, I'm going to go join Team Liquid and that's going to get me over this current hurdle in my life. Like, that's not how it works. Like, I think the bulk of us have to stew in our own adversity, and either it knocks us down and keeps us down.